Now tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming back an old friend, Mr. Bruce Fenton, together with his lovely wife, Daniela, and a little one in the pushchair there. Now, some of you may know Bruce from his attendance at quite a few of our meetings, and others may know him as a regular guest presenter on the television programme Ancient Aliens, with Giorgio Tsoukalos and David Childress, amongst others, and also from the Unexplained Files. Bruce is a British multidisciplinary scientific researcher and media personality. He curated the popular paleoanthropology site, ancientnews.net. I'm not sure, is it still running?
I ended that one now.
Oh, he's ended that one, okay. But he did run it. He graduated from Anglia Ruskin University as a Bachelor of Technology. His expeditions to megalithic ruins in the Amazon jungle and in the Georgian Caucasus have seen him feature in the UK Telegraph newspaper, as well as on the Science Channel and the History Channel. Amongst many things, Bruce has researched anomalous phenomena, technosignatures, genomic SETI, panspermia, and as I previously mentioned, paleoanthropology. Now, Bruce is in fact the research director of the Alien Technosignatures Research Group. Hey! He and Daniela are the authors of books including the Into Africa Theory of Human Evolution, The Last Zolkin, and Exogenesis Hybrid Humans. Now on to tonight. Bruce's talk is entitled, Did Ancient Aliens Update the Human Brain? Now this is a subject which you may have seen discussed on Ancient Aliens, but tonight it's going to be explored in depth by Bruce himself. So please give your usual warm, super welcome to Mr. Bruce Fenton.
Thank you very much. I suppose the short summary for most of conventional society is that I'm a weirdo who spends too much time looking at aliens, but that's the short version. So yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? Did ancient aliens upgrade the human brain? Now, I think the starting for most people on the planet is probably no, but we'll see what you think by the end. So, should I do the next slide? So the first part of the presentation, we're going to focus a little on stories, and particularly how stories change the world. Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Yeah, a little talk. Great, thank you, appreciate it. Okay, that's better. So yeah, how new stories change the world. So we bob into the next one. So we start off with a story. It's 1976, a few months before I was born, and NASA has sent the Viking landers to Mars. Now, there were two of the landers, as you may well know, and the primary mission was to understand the atmosphere and geology of the red planet. Although obviously they tend to taint it more red than it is in some of their images. Here you can see a picture of Carl Sagan, loved by some, hated by others. A bit of a skeptic on UFOs, of course.
He's in the audience tonight.
Hopes. Standing next to a replica of one of the Viking landers there.
He introduced you. He introduced you just now.
Oh, the old Sagan deer. And then we've got a very interesting account of what happened after this arrival, because although the primary missions were geological and atmospheric, which, to be honest, was not that exciting for most of the public, they had been pressured into including some experiments that could detect the presence of life. Now, you might have thought that would be something NASA would have put as a primary goal, but they were not particularly keen on it. So these experiments were run, and one by one, the results started to come in, with positive, 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 and at that point, according to the notes from the mission that have been accessed by the scientists since then, you would expect to find a sense of excitement in there, but instead there was a sense of fear. Go to the next slide. There was a fourth experiment included, and this one, it was meant to look for organic materials, traces of organics. Now everyone expected Mars to have these, because even as traces from meteorite bombardments, we know that organics are common in meteorites, it should have been there. But the experiment came back negative. A lot of people were sceptical even at the time that something had gone wrong with that. But, according to the notes, instead of being maybe disappointed, there was a general sense of relief. They didn't have to announce life on Mars. Of course, you would think, well, they'll go back and they'll check the results. There was no planned mission to look for life for another 40 years. Go to the next slide. And there's one of the interesting images from Mars. That strange rock is covered in what a lot of mycologists believe are mushrooms. And in fact, if you can see, there's actually stalks coming out with those little heads on. They look very much like mushrooms on Earth. They're also throughout the sand, all around the rock and in many other locations. They've been seen to disappear, appear at new spots, and very much behaving like life. So we move on to the next one.
Our laptop's got a mind of its own tonight.
Let's do that presentation. It did that to me something. I think if you have to, when you start clicking, it should stop automatic. I don't know why. But yeah, go to the next one. So another story, another interesting one. Here are some images of organisms that have been collected coming into the atmosphere. And this is a project that was headed up by Milton Wainwright, who is a collaborator of the noted panspermia kind of expert, Professor Vikram Singha. Now, he has found all kinds of strange, tiny organisms up in the upper atmosphere, and he's just a small sample of them. Now, they are so small that they should not have been carried up by wind or any known forces on Earth, and must be instead raining down from space. He's had a problem getting that accepted. Despite putting out papers to peer review, he's been largely ignored. It's interesting as well that he says that when he got into this topic, he initially expected to almost be beating people back, because it sounded so exciting, panspermia, life from space, brilliant. And as a kind of microbiologist, I thought this would be a fascinating area to get into. And what he realised the more he looked into this career path was almost nobody wanted to do it. They were all scared to do it because they saw it as a career ruiner, that you'd probably never get grants and you may also face all sorts of issues from your community. So he was quite shocked to find that out. So you move on to the next one. Now, there's a couple of I find really interesting organisms that have been detected in the upper atmosphere. These two. That little sphere there is made of very, very hard alloys of titanium, and inside was a kind of an organic goo. And so they found this in the impact site of the collector. There was actually a kind of a little crater. So again, he was very sure that this had come in from space at a considerable speed. And while he's not sure if it's natural or unnatural, he said in theory it could be something like an artificial panspermia seed. Then if there's an advanced civilization out there that would spread life, throughout the cosmos, it might very well create miniature, very hardened seeds, artificial seeds containing DNA or whatever organic materials that they have, and shoot these out into space. So that may actually be an alien panspermia seed. The other thing there at the bottom is an organism with its face basically poking out of a small grain of a type of salt, and so that could in theory be an alien creature looking at us. All quite stunning. And I should say, he's contacted NASA and he went to all the big scientific organisations, asked them to replicate his work, and he said he didn't get any response, that they weren't interested. So if we go on to the next one. And here you can see a scan of the Algeringa meteorite, which is a very well studied meteorite from the early 19th century, and somewhat recently a collaborating team of Russian and US scientists, including an ex-NASA scientist, they've reanalyzed this meteorite, looking at some of the inclusions, which they believe are fossils. In fact, they've stated that they are absolutely certain, that it's beyond doubt that what we're looking at is fossil life. And this meteorite is older than the solar system. So it would not come from Earth, it cannot be ancient Earth life. They've also discounted contamination. And you would think, again, that this should be big news. Of course, it was barely even reported on, I think only in Russia and maybe one non-Russian news site talked about this, and it's kind of faded into the background. So if we move on again. This is particularly, I think, a particularly interesting story. This is from the mission to Ceres, which was the NASA Dawn probe mission. And whilst they were kind of imaging this dwarf planet, which is out in the asteroid belt, they found that there was this strange area with this luminous material. And this is called the Okator crater. There was a theory that this might be some kind of cryovolcanoes, which is volcanoes that spew up an icy material. Although, again, this is a question because nobody can figure out why there'd be a heat source that would allow this volcanic activity to happen. So, move on again. And so one of the interesting things about this bright spot is that you can see in that top image, on the left, as sort of the night falls on Ceres, you can see that bright spot. And again, once that part of the dwarf planet is fully in shadow, it's still luminous. Seems strange if it's just reflecting light. Now, deep inside that same crater, and in that same glowing spot, they have found something else very interesting. A geometric pattern. If you move on to the next one. And so this was actually detected both with an AI that was designed to look for geometry in space images, that was trained on thousands of images to look for what would be artificiality. And as a kind of a backup, they also got a number of volunteers, not specialists in any way, to have a look at the same images and see if they saw anything interesting. And both the volunteers and the AI reported seeing geometry in this spot. So what appears to be something rather like the alchemical symbol, which is interesting in itself. The triangle with the square and the circle inside. So certainly be familiar to anyone who's involved with alchemy. So we move on to the next one. So there's a zoomed out view. So that's the Okator crater, and in that central area is where you have, in the middle of the largest glowing spot, you have this, what appears to be a geometric pattern, potentially faded from eons, but detectable both by humans and AI. The other thing that I find interesting is that these spots look almost like some kind of star map, and that with that potentially marking some home node. We don't know. Of course, there's been no further follow-up to go back and find out or to look closer, so we just have what we have of it so far, these images. But you would think pretty interesting, certainly something you'd want to take a closer look at. Geometry within a luminous spot on a dwarf planet. I mean, it's amazing. So the question here is then, is the scientific process malfunctioning? Because something seems to be wrong here. That we have all these interesting detections of what could be alien intelligence or simple life forms, life out there, and yet scientists, the bulk of scientists are not that interested. They seem to be avoiding these detections. So we seem to definitely have a problem. So move on to it. So that's where we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening. So I don't know if some of you might be familiar with this, but the paradigm change cycle. This is a model designed by Thomas Kuhn, who was a historian of science and a philosopher. He came to understand that really science, as we perform it, isn't entirely objective. That we're human beings. The scientists have their allegiances, they have their own invested interests, they have their feelings about things, and most importantly, they are dedicated to the paradigm in which they work. And that is the general structure that helps them perform science to answer the subtopics, the questions within a topic area. So you have this cycle which begins off with pre-science, and that is the discovery of a problem. And if you look at it from the perspective of, say, aliens or UFOs, there is no real framework as it stands, because the mantra is, it's never aliens. So we're in a kind of a pre-science. Once you have a model to do analysis, it moves into normal science. And that's what most fields will operate in for the bulk of their existence. But then over time, you have anomalies, and the anomalies will accrue. And so you move through into what's called model drift, that the overall paradigm is starting to show a few cracks. After a while, there's so many of these anomalies that are not being resolved that you move into model crisis, where most of the scientists understand something is drastically wrong with the overall paradigm that they're working in. This moves on to model revolution. And in model revolution, you get multiple competing models with different interest groups looking to put their new model in place. And there will be, sometimes that can be quite aggressive and a difficult stage before you get to a paradigm change, where the new paradigm is selected, sometimes because it answers the questions best, other times maybe just because one group had more influence, more power, whatever it is, and then their paradigm becomes the new normal, and you move back into normal science. So as the quote here says, the proponents of competing paradigms are always at least slightly at cross purposes. Neither side will grant all the non-empirical assumptions that the other needs in order to make its case. Like Proust and Berlehoff arguing about the composition of chemical compounds, they are bound partly to talk through each other. Though each may hope to convert the other to his way of seeing his science and its problems, neither may hope to prove his case. The competition between paradigms is not the sort of battle that is fought by proofs. So in other words, it's not just about the evidence, but it's about all of these other human considerations, vested interests, and there's a lot more to it than just, we've got the best evidence, we win. So if you move on to the next one. There's a quote here from Dr. Stephen Benner, and he's a biochemist, but he's also the chap that looked at the notes from the Viking mission. And so there's a comment from him on this topic, and he notes that the consensus can strike back. Research that opposes a consensus is higher risk and more difficult to fund. The consensus can fight back, especially if it is institutionalized. Individuals will go to their graves believing what they were taught in school to believe, but institutionalized consensus will send others to their graves to defend the institutional consensus. On to the next one. A good quote from Max Planck, a physicist. An important scientific innovation rarely makes its way by gradually winning over and converting its opponents. It rarely happens that Saul becomes Paul. What does happen is its opponents gradually die out, and that the growing generation is familiarized with the ideas from the beginning. Another instance of the fact that the future lies with the youth. Move on. So the question is the paradigm shifting? I think it is, and we'll talk about why. So next. So first of all, I think everyone's pretty familiar now with ARROW, so obviously this all-domain anomaly resolution office in the US. Now you can have different opinions on whether or not you think it's doing its job, whether it's a good thing, a bad thing, but it exists, and that in itself is a sign that the paradigm is changing. That we have this new all-domain anomaly research resolution office that is looking at UFOs, UAP, potential alien craft, accounts from whistleblowers, all of this. They're in place to do that. And the media is reporting on it. It's showing that there's some kind of serious thinking from at least some areas of the US government and the US military. And so that in itself is an important clue that things are changing. Move to the next one. And then of course the Galileo project, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. And that's Harvard-backed, so you've got an esteemed university backing a project that is specifically looking at both UFOs and alien probes. So, I mean, that again is quite a wild step forward. And at the beginning, it was just pretty much just Avi Loeb and a couple of, his collaborators. But look at this. I mean, the scientists are pretty much queuing up now to join this project. They haven't sort of turned people down. And of course, it's not just scientists. They've got all kinds of influencers, funders, all sorts of people that have come on board with Galileo project. And it's now sending out a mission to look for debris from an object that exploded over Papua New Guinea, which they think could be an alien probe. So, I mean, that is immense. And then the next one. So here's a survey that was done, a Gallup poll, do Americans believe in UFOs? Now this was a 2021 survey. And what they came up with was that 41% of the people surveyed believed that some UFOs were alien spacecraft, which is enormous. That's not a fringe belief, that's enormous. But the interesting thing there is if you look from 2019, when they last did this, 33% of people believed that, right? No new evidence had been produced between 2019 and 2021 that aliens were here in craft. No new evidence. There was more discussion, there were more stories, but there was a lot more media reporting, and there were scientists stepping into the conversation, and you had these organisations like Galileo, and ATIP and all these other organisations. So the impact of just the seriousness of the conversation kind of changing was enormous, enough to shift massively from 33% to 41%. So this is why I say, well, it's not always about the evidence that changes the paradigm. So if we move on to the next one. And of course, since then, since 2021, well, we now have NASA has waded in. After several months of people waiting to see, what's going to come of their announcement that they are going to become involved with UAP. We've had their first panel, and in 4 hours of droning on, namely, and I'm sure that some people have waded through it. Not the most exciting presentation on the topic that we've ever heard, but the fact was, it was presented as a serious subject. And there was all kinds of other organisations in there, the FAA and others, that were stepping in to talk about UFOs and UAP. Again, that's a massive sea change. And while people in the kind of UFO world wouldn't see much of that, but we've got to remember, for the average person on the street, NASA is almost a gold seal of approval on a topic, to say that this is serious and we're going to take this as real scientific research now and move forward. And then very recently, of course, we've had the intelligence officials say US has retrieved craft of non-human origin. Absolutely massive. Again, this, and of course this is this week's kind of the elephant in the room, in a way I was thinking, do I even bother coming and do a talk? Because, all the press is talking about recovered alien spaceships. Who needs me to talk about it, right? But that's what's happening. We've got these whistleblowers, we've got these people that are coming forward, and they're telling new accounts of what they say is happening. And the main point there is the global media is reporting on it, and they're reporting on it largely as a serious matter, serious topic. That's huge. Move on. So we've got this whistleblower testimony where they're saying, quote here, the non-human intelligence phenomenon is real. We are not alone, Gray says. Retrievals of this kind are not limited to the United States. This is a global phenomenon, and yet a global solution continues to elude us. And so we've had a number of people come forward, and obviously we have here David Groch, who's the main whistleblower, but he's supported by Gray, who's kind of an anonymous senior officer that's still in his role, so can't be named. But coming forward and saying that, as far as they're concerned, there is alien intelligence, there are craft here, and that some craft are being recovered. Now, there's a debate, of course, but where's the evidence? Where's the pictures? But the point is, again, that we're dealing with a paradigm change, which is mostly about bringing more people into taking the topic seriously. It doesn't need you to wheel out a crashed craft. And I think that's what a lot of people get wrong in these topics, is they think that you desperately need that craft. I'd love to see it, who wouldn't? But you can have a paradigm shift with no new evidence, just by having the scientists and the media and the public all starting to take a topic seriously. And that's what's happening. So move on to the next one. So somewhat recently, myself and some collaborators have founded our own research organisation, which is the Alien Technosignatures Research Group. And obviously our kind of mantra there is expanding the search for signatures of alien technologies into new scientific domains. We're looking for technosignatures on Earth, not out in space, not out in Alpha Centauri or anything like that. We're a small team at the moment with biologists, geologists, philosophers, religious studies, because that's you need to understand as well that a lot of this is going to be about philosophy, religion, social sciences, how people think, psychology, not just the hard evidence. Now, we are also, as it stands, I understand it to be the first funded SETI-linked organisation in Europe, which is quite amazing. But you'd think there'd be some out there. But there's no SETI projects funded anywhere in Europe as it stands, which is quite mind-bending. I think that'll change. I think we're in times where we're going to see a lot of new organisations appearing. I'll move on to the next one.
Bruce, can I just ask who's funding you?
There's a US tech investor guy who's also a funder of the Galileo project. And so I can say that he's given them a lot more than he's giving us, but I can understand why. They've got Harvard behind them. We haven't. You know, so he's taking a punt that we have found something and that maybe we can find more. So, I mean, once he's happy to put his name on it, you know, they'll be out there and people will link his link to these other projects as well. A news story that changes the world. So, can we move on to the next one? The primary Algeringa contactees, Jerry Bostock and Valerie Barrow. So just to very briefly introduce the people that are behind the story that I've been investigating. So Valerie Barrow was a spiritual medium and a regression therapist, and someone I suppose, very much open to all sorts of anomalous phenomena and this sort of strange aspects of life. And Jerry Bostock was a respected Aboriginal elder, also known as he was a healer, a writer, playwright, and many other roles that he's known for. Both of them have unfortunately passed on now. That's right. And this backstory to the Algeringa case starts off with an object called a Algeringa. And some of them look somewhat like that image there. Like it's, there's copies said to be of the original ancient Algeringas. They're basically kind of either circular or oval objects engraved, usually with concentric circles and sometimes other geometric patterns. But this original Algeringa that we're interested in, the backstory is that it was found decades ago by a trader, an Afghan trader, who was plying his wares across the deserts of Australia. That used to be a common thing, that you'd have these Afghans with their camels. And he stumbled on a cave near to Uluru. And in that cave, he found an artifact that seemed to be semi-luminous in the darkness. And so he picked it up and he took it with him. He actually asked local tribes if they wanted to take it, because he thought it must be something special. And so he asked them. And he was met with fear, that they wanted nothing to do with it, nothing to do with it at all. In the end, it was kind of passed down in the family, and back in the early 1990s, it was given to a family friend who was willing to try and get it back to the Aboriginal custodians, most like the Arente people near Uluru, and she became kind of unwell, and so there was a point where she couldn't continue this quest, so she was looking for someone to temporarily hold it until she came back from hospital. She'd heard of Valerie through a friend, and that her house was called Algeringa, which is the Aboriginal term, the Arente people's term for what we'd think of as the dream time. Now, the fact that it kind of linked, you know, it's got a Algeringa stone, this Algeringa object, there's a house called Algeringa, a lady who lives there is very open-minded and into kind of alternative thought. She thought, well, that sounds perfect. So she turns up, asks her, will you please look after this artifact temporarily? Valerie agrees. It's kept in a box, it's wrapped up, she never looks on it. So as she told me, she never looked on it, it was wrapped in paper bark, kept in a box. But soon after it arrived in the house, she started to have some kind of download communication. That an entity saying it was called Algeringa, and it was a star person from this original creation time. So that there was a whole load of information about our past that we didn't know about, and that it intended to provide to us. And that it had made its way to her, not accidentally, but had manipulated people to be there. And so that's how this kind of begun, with this strange download of information about our past. If we move on. Now, I find it very interesting actually the topic of Valerie's background is that I only sort of recently realised that she'd begun by looking at the cover of Communion. And I thought that's kind of funny because so many times we hear about contactees or abductees or experiencers who were in some way kind of awoken by looking at the cover of that book. And so she sees that as the start of her mission, is that when she first saw that, when Strieber first went to Australia, there was posters were put up all around the CBD with this face on it. And so she saw one of these and it had a reaction to her, and she bought the book, read it, and then started to have her own kind of recall of having been, you know, an abduction type experience, an encounter with entities on a table, and this kind of knowing that she had agreed to a mission in her life. So I always thought that's quite fascinating, because a lot of times Strieber's book pops up in cases. So go on to the next one. And so not long after coming into receipt of this artefact, Uncle Jerry is driving through Clandidly, New South Wales with a friend of Valerie's, Rachel. And she mentions, this is where my friend Valerie lives, in a home called Algeringa. Now, as an Aboriginal elder, that name kind of popped out at him. And so he said, well, you know, let's go there. Now, Uncle Jerry's background is he was the elder of the Bundjalung nation, and it just happens as well that they do have a kind of historical belief that aliens may have played a role in our ancestry. Not all members of that nation believe that, but there is a subgroup that does believe that there's been some kind of star people ancestry, which is quite interesting. So move on. Another thing that comes up as well is that Jerry tells us an account of having had a really vivid dream when he was in his teenage years. This is relevant in a minute. So Jerry's dream. In the dream, I was on board a huge spacecraft in orbit around a blue and green planet. Everything on the ship had a bright sheen to it, particularly the uniforms of the people. There was lots of hurried activity. Coloured lights were flashing and bells were ringing. Everyone was in a hurry, following certain procedures as if there was an emergency. I was seeing everything through the eyes of a crew member, perhaps a pilot or navigator. I felt an urgency to get my family together before some imminent event occurred. The scene changed, and I was on board a smaller craft, escaping from the mothership. As I looked out the porthole, I became aware of two things: the planet we were heading towards and the mothership we were leaving. The mothership was immense, a saucer or mushroom-shaped silvery craft with hundreds of smaller ships leaving it, one of them containing my wife. They were all heading away in every direction, trying to escape as quickly as possible. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash, and the mothership blew up. The impact on me was so overwhelming that I woke from the dream. Move on to the next one. Now, many a year ago, back in 2001, I had a strange experience that I now see as being potentially related to this. During a shamanic journey, I found myself on board a craft with a guy in a kind of blue outfit with slightly bluish skin who was piloting his way to what appeared to be Earth, and that there was a sense of having just flown away from some disaster where his colleagues had been killed en masse and that he was under pursuit. Now, I don't know whether I experienced it as being me or just being in the ship, but it was a very powerful experience. Didn't know what to do with it. At the time, I had no particular involvement with the topic, with aliens, or particular focus on that, much more interested in shamanism. But years later, that would come back when I encountered Valerie's story whilst writing Ancient Aliens in Australia back in 2013. And two researchers in Australia, Stephen and Evan Strong, some might know, they sort of noted to me and said, by the way, you might want to read this book by a friend of ours because it overlaps with some of what you've talked about with these beings. So yeah, we can go on to the next one. So after the meeting at Valerie's house, and Jerry kind of getting into a conversation where she admitted she had this artifact, explained that she'd had contact with this being, and even sort of offered him, did he want to kind of take the stone or be with it? And he looked quite scared, she said, when she said that he didn't want to take any possession of it or hold it. But he did say that, look, I think what we need to do is we should go to a special Aboriginal site, sacred site, down near Gosford. And at that site there's also the infamous Gosford glyphs. It's actually a carry-on just outside of Gosford. But again, some of you may have seen these. They've been covered in various websites and media, and people have talked about these. They're a kind of a controversial set of what appear to be ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, carved into two walls, up in a very small rocky outcrop in the forests just beyond the edges of Gosford. Now, I can't tell you whether or not they're legitimate Egyptian. There's been Egyptian experts who have gone there and said that it tells a story of a wrecked ship, possibly of crew that survived. Now, some say it's a story of Egyptians, some say it's a story of aliens, others have said it's a mixture of both, and probably the majority of academics would just write it off as a hoax. I can say on the hoax thing that it's in a funny place for a hoax, because you literally, if you don't know it's there, you just walk past it. You wouldn't find it unless someone took you there. But this site is also an Aboriginal sacred site. So irrespective of the glyphs, there's two areas there, a men's business site and a women's business site, where the women's business site was for birthing, and the men's business for obviously meeting and other ancestral traditional things they had to do. So they arrange to go to this site, and this time they're accompanied also by Helen, who's a friend of Valerie's. She's also a gifted psychic medium. So they've got two mediums and an elder. And so whilst they're there, Valerie has this initial kind of download, channeling contact with Algeringa again. Talks a bit about there having been a past where beings from around the cosmos had come here, that there'd been life forms had been changed here, different animals. There's a whole narrative. Most are not too relevant to this, but so they had that experience. And then afterwards, soon afterwards, they walked up to another area called Whale Rock. And that's where there's a large engraving of a whale, and it's not far, just a few minutes walk from this site. And from there you can look out towards the bay, towards Gosford, and there's a large watery inlet there. So Jerry also notes in these conversations that there's a talk about them having, in the experience they have whilst there, it feels as though they've kind of slipped in time, that now they're looking at the forest and it seems different, it seems denser, it's hotter. And also, they feel different, and they realise they don't look completely human. And as they look down across at the bay, they see a saucer crashed into the edge of the water, and another one hovering above it, pulling beings out from the water. Jerry has a kind of a knowing that he starts to realise that this craft that's in the water is connected to him, and that in some way that he's on that craft, that he was the pilot of that craft. If we move on to the next one. And so he experiences it as having been there and having drowned, pinned inside by broken craft debris. And so they also start to all have a kind of a recall of what happened. They remember this giant craft coming to Earth, being in orbit, and then being surprise attacked by another group that is resident on this planet. That the original idea was that there was going to be a handover, that there had been a negotiation, Earth was to be handed over to this different alliance, and there's another group here that they've been in possession, technically illegally, of Earth for a very long time, and that supposedly it's all going to be a peaceful transition, and instead there's a betrayal, and what is essentially mostly an unarmed ship, some on board lower the craft's shields, and it's blown from the sky. Only a few ships make it to the surface, most are destroyed in space, and that's what they experience. So if we move on. Now the original plan, as they understood this, was that colonisation, that they had arrived here, there was going to be a handover, they were going to colonise the planet. They'd been modifying their forms on the way, using genetic engineering. That this is their way of moving around the cosmos and taking new worlds, is you change yourself. And you think about it, all planets have different atmospheres and environments. So what they do is they make themselves fit to the atmosphere and environment of the planet. Now they've been doing this on the route, but most of them have not got anywhere near to the end of that process when this attack occurs. So they're on the beach, and Valerie and Jerry can see that some of them are struggling with the sun, that they're being burned, others are gasping for breath, that they are not ready to colonise this planet. And the few that do survive, they realise that it's game over for Plan A. But what they can do is that they can modify some of the hominins and make them more like themselves. And in this way, they feel, continue the mission of bringing this planet closer to being under a more benevolent control system. And so, the Star People decided to genetically engineer the upstanding ape-like creature. Genes from the Star People were intermingled with the animal man embryo, then implanted into the females. The babies were born with a larger skull, a little less hair, which went on then to evolve, so that the more children born, the less hair was manifested. We go on to the next. Now, they also, over time, as more of the story unfolded and more people got involved, in the end there were several dozen people with memories and experiences that are connected to this case. So it wasn't just the three of them. In the end, there was so many people that came forward, got involved, saying they also remembered being there, or they had visions of this, or dreams. So they got a larger story, and in this, they also come to understand that 5 years later, another group arrives, and these are a leonine type of being. So these are much more aggressive, but also are allied with this original group. And so they haven't got much truck for what's happened. They don't like this at all. So this is an enforcement group. And so they warn those on Earth. They say, look, you've broken the agreement, you've destroyed a peaceful colony ship, you leave now, or we start a bombardment from space. And so what they do, this is what they said, they can pull in asteroids to the sizes that could crack a planet if they need to. So it makes our nuclear weapons look like pea shooters. And so they begin this bombardment of underground bases. Now there's a representation here of a leonine humanoid. That's a 40,000-year-old art piece. So you have to wonder, did someone encounter one at some point? We move on. That's an interesting aside, actually, that back in 1994, Christmas time, you had the famous Gosford mass UFO sighting. Again, some of you may know this one, that there was either a sphere or cylinder type craft, I think that's depending on the angle you look at it, that was reported being over the water, covered in lights and with beams of light going down into the water. Now, it actually went on all the way up till New Year that people were seeing this, and there was some quite respected people, an aircraft controller and other people that were reporting this, many that saw it. So it was right off, just off the coast of the waters of Gosford. And so this seemed to be just traveling around the water until it stopped, and it sucked up a large volume of water, and then after a while it was reported that this then emptied it back out. So what exactly was it doing? You have to wonder. So that was a report by a great number of people, so that's a kind of a famous Australian sighting. Now that is just 4 months before the trip to Gosford with Jerry and Val. Just 4 months before, apparently some non-human technology was flying around that bay, doing something, looking for something, and sucking up something, right? So it makes you wonder if they're not recovering something ahead of this case being better known.
Bruce?
Yeah.
Do you know the same year, 94, Ed Walters photographed that weird UFO photograph of the aircraft sucking up water almost exactly like that picture?
Right, and also it should be noted as well that there's quite a lot of cases where water seems to be sucking. These craft seem to have this ability to pull up enormous volumes of water. So it does make me wonder if they weren't retrieving something out of the bay. Now if we go on to the next one. So there's a big question there, isn't there? Is this more than science fiction? Because we hear all sorts of stories, particularly with contactees, abductees, witnesses. There's hundreds of stories. And also with channelers, mediumship, all of that. We get lots and lots of stories. Most of them are impossible to sieve for data, or to validate beyond that we can say, well, we believe it, or we don't believe it. We find the person credible, or we don't find them credible. It's really hard to go beyond that. Now, in this case, we obviously set out to do more than just believe it or not. So if we move on. And that's essentially the underlying premise of the Alien Intelligence Research Group, is to look at this and see whether we can get sufficient details and evidence to put it out in scientific papers. Now obviously that is not going to be accepted very well by the scientific community, we understand that, but going to basically, to some degree, play their own game. So we set out to do 3 aspects of the project. There's geological SETI, and that's going to focus on debris that we believe is associated with the craft. An analysis, well, the analysis we've done of it, but writing up the argument for why we say it's from an alien megastructure. Genomic SETI, looking at evidence for manipulation of DNA. And lastly, a SETI post-detection, which is really more the social sciences. It's looking at what would be the impact of confirming aliens, what would change in our societies, what is the resistance to that happening, all of that. So we break it down into 3 main project goals. Okay, go on to the next one. So was there really a craft? Did this really happen? Well, people that follow me online probably know that I've been talking a lot about tektites for a while now. Now, it's not a topic that I ever would have got into under normal circumstances. Tektites are a form of glass. They're an unusual form of glass. And as noted here, the enduring mystery of Australian tektites is that it's accepted that they are mysterious, and that they have been mysterious for now almost 200 years, with all kinds of experts putting their minds to the understanding of how they formed, where they come from, how they are distributed, and yet there's still some big questions. Now, the Australasian tektites, they're of particular interest to me, and they're over about 75% silica, other materials in there, metals, aluminium, about 10%. There's quite a few other compounds in there, quite interesting makeup, particularly the silica. Because if we're talking about a craft, and we're told that this craft was a silica AI craft, right? So the mainframe should be silica. We have this debris, 75% silica. It rains down across a vast area. Go on to the next one, I think I should have the map there. Right, when you look at that, that's the debris field. Enormous. It's about 30% of the Earth's surface has got these tektites, right? They're from a single event. They're chemically homogeneous, so they're from a singular event that occurred. They're very well dated. We know that it occurred around about 788,000 years ago. Hypothetically, the main site where the explosion of the parent body happened is around Indochina. Now, the conventional view is an impact in Indochina. The unconventional view is an explosion above Indochina. So that's why we have a cluster. You see a cluster of debris around Thailand, China, up at the top there. And then we have if you follow it down, there's another big cluster across southern Australia, and then the debris field finishes right down there in Antarctica. Okay, if we go on to the next slide. Now, for a long time, the guys at NASA, quite a few of these NASA guys who were involved, they argued that these tektites must have come from the moon. And the reason for that is because they know that particularly this one type, the Australian button tektite, has entered the atmosphere. There's no doubt about that. It's come in as a spherical piece of cold glass, and then as it entered the atmosphere, the front edge melted, and it ran back, and it forms these distinctive shapes. So there's no doubt, we know that these have to have come in from space. So one of the strongest hypotheses was the idea that there was a glassy material on the moon, probably volcanic glass, and an asteroid had struck this glass, dislodged a proportion of it, sent it flying across to Earth, and then it had rained down across the planet. Now that was, for a long time, that was the joint kind of top argument along with a terrestrial impact. Now eventually, what happened is we retrieved materials from the moon, and we realised that they do not fit with tektites. Also, there were arguments suggesting that it just wouldn't be possible because if you had glass that's travelling through space, like a swarm, it would be disrupted by the pull of the sun. And so it became kind of obvious that it should rain down either across the entire planet and out into, beyond that, the moon, it should be everywhere. We should be finding it everywhere. Or if it's just one chunk, it would break up in our atmosphere and it would be limited to just basically maybe like 100 kilometres across. So in other words, it does not fit with that. So although they were right in saying that yes, it has to come in from space, it has to be some kind of glass that's pre-existing, has to come in from the atmosphere, and indeed it has to come in at a gentle angle, because when you see this melting, when an asteroid comes in, it comes in so fast, so hot, that the outside part just evaporates. You don't see this, you rarely see this melting like that. So in other words, it comes straight in, and it's, it burns away completely, or the edges burn away. This is not seen unless you have a much slower and gentler entry. So in other words, they said they think it came along orbital paths from a fragmenting object that was in orbit. So we move along. Right, and these buttons, they're clustered in two areas. You see, that is the path, what would be the orbital path of the parent body. So the main explosion occurring there in that central red arrow above Indochina, and the end of the debris field down there, just beyond southern Australia to Antarctica. But you have two kind of clusters of these button-type tektites, and that's up in Indochina and down in Australia. And I would suggest that's because when we have this explosion in the air, some material is pushed back, some is pushed forwards, some material rains down directly below, we'll get to that, but we have all the indicators of an object that is blown up in orbit, not something impacting. Otherwise these should be everywhere. These particular types should be at all parts of the debris field, but they're not. Right, if we go on to the next one. These are different kinds. I don't want to sort of, go too technical, but basically you have the spheres. You look at the size of that sphere, by the way. That's someone's hand. So you've got these enormous cannonball-like spheres. And you've also got the Myeongdong tektite, which is a layered tektite found only in Indochina. So it obviously hasn't travelled through the atmosphere. It's just layers of glass that are melted together, folded, twisted together. The button tektites, as we've discussed. And then you have these discs, dumbbells, teardrops. And those are all formed by hot glass spinning through the air, and they form these other types. And so we know there's some distinctive different types of this glass, which you're not seeing in any other, say, volcanic glass or in other tektites. Particularly the button types, Myeongdongs, these are unique to the Australian tektite stream field. So if we move on again. Now very quickly, just visually, just to compare. This is, on the left, you have impact melt glass from a crater. Right. Looks like melted rock. Yeah, it's got bubble cavities in it. It is actually a glass, it's a mineral glass. And now you look at an Australite button tektite. So it's glaringly different, even to any amateur eye. You see there's something glaringly different here. So instead we have this homogeneous, very fine glass, much more like to either volcanic glass or human-made glass. Whereas these natural impact glasses, to most people, would just think they're a piece of rock. You wouldn't even realise they were glass. The other is the bubbles, is that this occurs when you have an impact. It's a quick, hot event, a lot of energy, but the energy dissipates rapidly. So what you find is you get these foamy melts. So that area is full of bubble cavities where the gas begins to exit, it cools, it's frozen in place, and you have all of those bubbles. When you look at these, technically clearly do not have them. I mean, none of the types have them. They have occasionally very small bubble in them, nothing like what we see at these confirmed impact sites. So if we go on to the next one. So the Muongnong distal ejector, it's considered to be distal ejector. So the idea, this is, if we're saying that tektites are material being thrown a very long way, distal ejector is to the most distant types. You'd have to ask, how big is this crater? Because this map here specifically shows where we have the Muongnong type tektite. Well, it's enormous, exactly enormous, because you look at it, you've got pieces up in China, all the way to Thailand, down through the bottom of Vietnam. So if these are at the crater site, and look at the size, these chunks, everyone accepts these could not have flown far. If there was an impact, these would not go far. They're massive, some of them over 20 kilos, right? So these should mark the crater. Or, so he was trying to say that the crater stretches from China down to there, and yet we can't see it. No one's found the crater, right? So this should be an obvious, enormous crater site, bigger than the one that we see for the, well, at least on a scale of what we see for the dinosaur eradication at Chicxulub. We should see something like that, the Yucatan Peninsula crater, where you have this vast geological formation, which is 65 million years old, right? You can still detect it very easily. Now this is 780,000 years old, and no one can see it, right? So something's very wrong. So we move along to the next one. Now there's a geologist who's kind of specialised in this topic, Norm Lerman, and looked at his work, and he asked this question: are you sure tektites are meteorite impact glass? Because obviously he's seen all these, he's aware of all these anomalies. And so what he argues is that these are signatures of an aerial burst event, or a series of aerial burst events in Indochina. That large pieces of debris from a parent came in and they exploded one after the other, and they would have been as powerful as nuclear bombs exploding in the atmosphere. And you would have had basically columns of flame and plasma melting the surface below. He says this is distinctively what we do see. He says in this image here, these are two different pieces of Muongnong. Why that's important, he says the first one has cooled, and then later, much later, probably hours later, liquid glass has splashed onto it and cooled. He said, well, that can't be from a singular event. There has to be two different explosions have happened here. So this is the fingerprint of aerial bursts. So if we move on to the next one. And we know in a recent study, this is in the Atacama Desert, they have found glass widespread in the Atacama Desert. And they realised that there had been an enormous explosion of fragments of a comet that had broken up. And it forms this distinctive, let's work out here, but this distinctive folding in the glass as it spins and it melts and it folds inside this plasma storm. And that is exactly what we see in the Muongnong tektites. This is again another signature of an aerial burst event, thankfully confirmed by the new study in the Atacama Desert. So if we move on to the next one. One of the very interesting things about this, and it might be a little bit wild, but again, this all ends down in Antarctica. We can see, so at the beginning of the field is up in Indochina. It's been shown chemically that the hottest, furthest thrown pieces are those down in Antarctica, and that's the end of the debris field. But there's something else interesting down at the end of that debris field. If we go on to the next one. A few years ago, scientists using satellites mapped huge craters under the Antarctic ice caused by an asteroid. One as big, they believe, as that that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Professor Frans van der Haven from Delft University in the Netherlands told the conference that the evidence showed that an asteroid measuring between 3 and 7 miles across had broken up in the atmosphere, and 5 large pieces had hit the Earth, creating multiple craters over an area measuring 1,300 by 2,400 miles. The effect would have been to melt all the ice in the path of the pieces, as well as the crust underneath. The biggest single strike caused a hole in the ice sheet, roughly 200 by 200 miles, which would have melted about 1% of the ice sheet, raising the water levels worldwide by 60 centimetres. But the climatic conditions were different at the time of the strike, about 780,000 years ago. from when the asteroid that is believed to have wiped out the dinosaurs struck Yucatan in Mexico. The impact created dust storms and fire that, by blocking out the sun, cooled the Earth's atmosphere so much that the dinosaurs could not survive. The Antarctica strike occurred during an ice age, so even tidal waves would have been weakened to mere ripples by the calming effects of icebergs on the ocean. There's a big question here. So we have a giant impact right at the end of the debris field, right where potentially the remnants of the craft could have gone down into the ice. Move on to the next one. There's another little point to go back to as well, is that humans were around. While this is all going on, all this mayhem is going on, there are early hominins wandering about. And we know that some of them saw these events, because up in China, at a site called Bose, they've actually found tektites alongside stone tools dated at the same period. So the working hypothesis basically that these hominins saw the fire, they saw the explosions, they headed towards it. When they got there, they found a cleared area. And as they walked into that cleared area, they would have seen this remarkable, smooth, black, glassy object from space. And I thought, oh my God, doesn't it sound like 2001: A Space Odyssey? And did they know that their world was about to change, that they were about to go into a new genetic revolution, just like those hominins in 2001: A Space Odyssey? So you sometimes wonder if wasn't some element of knowledge or channeling behind that film now, the more I've dug into this project. So we go on to the next slide. So what about the asteroid bombardment? So we're told, these beings really engineered a multi-directional asteroid bombardment. That should be mega. We should be able to pick that up. And I thought straight away at the time, I thought, well, I've never heard of that. Shouldn't that be like a Nat Geo special? Shouldn't we all know about the time when, asteroids were pummeling the Earth? Well, turns out actually, it did happen. Back in 2016, a group of scientists associated with Heidelberg University, they realised that there had been a number of impacts that had all occurred around about 790,000 years ago, and you've got them there. They found them in Asia, Australia, Canada, Central America, and obviously we've already touched on an Antarctica event, and of course the tektites. So they realised that there was multiple events, and they said, well, the other thing you'd look at, is this a singular impactor breaking up? Right? No, it turns out they have different chemical composition at each site. So these are different objects impacting from different sides of the planet. Well, isn't that what we were told happened? The right dating again, bang on. We'll move on to the next one. And around the same time, we have another immense event. We've got the last full reversal of the Earth's magnetic field. And so that happens to happen right on that time again. This is underway shortly after this. Now, this is not just a coincidence, and a lot of scientists are actually starting to move towards the view that probably the impacts in some way destabilised the planet and they caused the reversal. And this would have had all kinds of plasma phenomena in the sky, radiation we're getting through, affecting life. So this is another major event. Think of it. These hominids are living through times that are unimaginable for us. The skies are on fire. There's giant plasma forms in the air. There's things flying through, comets are, heading down. All sorts of, it just would have been mayhem for them. So you move on to the next one. And again, we're not done with the major events. Turns out that shortly after 800,000 years ago, the natural climate cycles of the planet become destabilised. And so we know going back before that, they're all very stable, and then around this very same time, suddenly it changes. So about 800,000 years ago, Earth's ice age cycle transitioned from being about 41,000 years long to about 100,000 years in duration. During a cycle, Earth's ice coverage ranges from 10% of the Earth's surface to 20 to 23%. Without the mid-Pleistocene transition, global human civilization at more than subsistence levels would never have begun. The MPT made possible warm interglacials, during which ice recedes closer to 10% coverage of Earth's surface, and which last not just 2,000, 3,000 years, but up to 10,000 years. This allows us enough time to launch sustained global human civilization to a point where billions of humans can live on Earth and at the time and possess technology. So, absolutely crucial event occurs alongside all the rest of this that allows for the potential for the rise of civilizations. So we'll move on to the next one. And then probably the biggest one, in some ways, although we've dealt with a lot of big events already, is something's happening to these hominins, something very odd. So for a very long time we've had a fairly stable population of what we call kind of super archaics. These would be mostly like Homo erectus types, and potentially, we know today there was a few others, but the bulk would have been Homo erectus, and there's a few splinter groups that are considered very small-brained, ape-men-like creatures, basically. The Homo erectus had already gone through the kind of transition where his brain had increased in size, and we'll show that in a minute. And I think something had happened 2 million years ago to Homo erectus, but it's not going to be the focus today. Prior to that, really, there was just ape men. I mean, Homo erectus is the first fully ground-based hominin. Before that, they lived in trees, in nests and stuff. So they're not really as weird to think of humans. Homo erectus really is the beginning. But then around about 800,000 years ago, in that period there, 765 to 550, we've got a genetic divergence happening. We've got changes in the genome that lead to a split. And so this group is already splitting away from the super archaics, and it will then go on to give rise to all the large-brained hominids. In other words, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and us. So this new group is splitting away just a little after 780,000 years ago, and it will lead to all of these large-brained hominids. So move on to the next one. Here's a little chart just to show you how rapidly the brain suddenly starts changing. So we've known for a long time with the fossil record that something really wacky happened. Because you get to, say, 2 million years ago, on that chart on the right, you can kind of see that there is a jump up. It's no longer a kind of a steady incremental change. There's a jump, and that's at Homo erectus. But that wasn't considered particularly anomalous, because Homo erectus' body is also increasing in size. But where it gets really strange is around 800,000 years ago, because you've got this massive jump, an even steeper jump upwards, and yet there is no increase in body size. This is just the brain goes into overdrived evolution. Right? So we've known that for a long time. What we didn't know is why, and there's been all sorts of speculation. So we move on. And then we've got today, of course, we can look in the genome. We don't need to just speculate. So there's been a few different angles that have come up with this. One of them was the realization that we have a different number of chromosomes to all the other hominids, to all the living primates, our closest relatives. And we know that this occurs. There's a fusion of 2 chromosomes, we consider ancestral chromosomes out of the primate lineage. They fuse together end to end, but only just before the human, Neanderthal, and Denisovan populations. And so obviously we don't see that fusion in gorillas, bonobos, and chimpanzees. And it is thought that this chromosomal fusion is one of the key events that gives rise to us. And so it happens to fuse on an active gene that's to do with the brain, reproduction, immune system. It also has deletions and additions of information at the fusion site when compared to primates. And it has to have given us a massive advantage. The reason we know that is because this should have been a chromosomal error. It should have been a problem. At best neutral, because most of them are not neutral, they're problems, and they make infertility a problem. So that would get swept away by evolutionary forces normally. So the theory is that it has to have met 3 criteria. It has to have happened in a small group, most likely in several individuals at once, which is very unlikely because a random mutation, you should see one of these issues, problems, appear in one individual. So there must have been at least a few of them that they interbred. So it has to be a small group that's also isolated from other hominins, otherwise it would disappear back into the background population. And the third one is, it has to have given an extraordinary benefit to persist and to become dominant, not just for a small group, but for all the humans on the planet. They all end up having this number of chromosomes. So this has to be an extraordinary benefit. Now that sounds a lot like a lab. A small group, isolated, all suddenly have these strange changes, they can only breed with each other, and eventually they're let out. Move on, please. It's not just chromosome 2. Chromosome 2 is probably the most well known in the kind of ancient aliens community, because I mean for many years there's been some talk about it. I remember Lloyd Pye, who I had some interactions with in the past, great researcher. He used to talk about chromosome 2, but unfortunately he passed on before we got to this kind of level of intricate understanding of the genome. So it's sad to say. But we now know that it's not just chromosome 2. We have what's called human accelerated regions. And this is fairly recent science. And they're saying here, so what makes us human? So again, just as chromosome 2 was once thought to be crucial in bringing us about, now we understand these human accelerated regions are also crucial. So what exactly are they? Well, when you go into the genome, you find in this area we used to think of as junk DNA. It's now called non-coding material because it's not coded for genes, but we know it's actually doing stuff. It's regulating genes, it's turning switches on and off. It can change the amount of expression of a gene, decrease it, increase it. So it could change the length of your arm, it could turn your arm off, it can do all sorts of stuff. We realised actually this is vital information that we for a long time just thought of as a bunch of junk. Now, it's also, most of it is incredibly stable. So you can look across all kinds of animals and find the same DNA code in this region. There's a quote here, the first one that was ever studied, HAR1, is particularly interesting because the fact that HAR1 basically went through an enormous change. I'll just quickly say it's a 118 DNA letter stretch. It was contrasted in chimps, chickens and humans. Now the chicken and the chimp, they're supposed to have been separate for 300 million years. It's a big chunk of time. There'd been 2-point mutations, 2 successful changes of a single DNA letter in all that time. So in other words, 1 successful change every 150 million years. Now that's pretty darn stable. Must be doing something important. Changes basically kill you. So when they compared it though between the chimp and the humans, which are supposed to be separate for just 7 million years, should have been no difference. What they found was 18 letters had changed. And to quote here from the lead scholar, the fact that HAR1 was essentially frozen in time through hundreds of millions of years indicates that it does something very important. That it then underwent abrupt revisions in humans suggests that this function was significantly modified in our lineage. Statistically speaking, the probability that a highly conserved DNA sequence will change multiple times over 6 million years of evolution is close to 0. That's Catherine Pollard, PhD, biostatistician at the Glasgow Institute. Move on to the next one. And then just recently, in the last few weeks, some of you might have caught this, a news story came out about a chance event about 1 million years ago that changed the human brain forever. Now this is related to Pollard's team and her work. Now this has been big news because they've now started to understand what happened. They don't know why, but they know kind of what. There was a change that occurred, and this change occurs not gradually, not incremental, accruing of mutations over thousands of years or millions of years. No, it was overnight. That it seems that they believe either in a single sperm or a single egg or in a single fetus, a radical change occurs. That actually it changes the way DNA folds and puts different regions together that were never previously together, changing what they do massively. And so as they say here, a chance rearrangement of the human genome over 1 million years ago probably kick-started the evolution of modern humans from our primate ancestors. A recent study explains why human DNA contains sections, many of which are involved in brain development, that are unique to us and are not shared with even our closest relatives, the chimpanzees. So their research so far does show just how unique and unlikely the evolution of the human brain really is. So in other words, nobody can fathom why this happens. This isn't gradual evolution. This is a sudden, massive change. And it gives rise to our differences from the other primates, most of them, and particularly to the modern human brain. So, just want to clarify there as well, with the dating, because I contacted the team, so I wanted to know about their dating, because of course, if they're saying 1 million or more, that doesn't fit. So I wanted to know how they'd gone about the dating, and they actually responded to me and they said, we didn't really actually do dating at this stage, we will be doing dating. But what we know is that this happened before the split of the Neanderthals, Denisovans and modern humans. That's the only dating we know at this point. In other words, it's at least around 780,000 years ago. They don't know if it was a bit earlier. So that dating was unfortunately used by journalists who haven't checked with the team for more accuracy. So I had to check that, because if you have a theory and it gets blown apart, I believe ethically it's my role. I have to say, hands up, I've got something wrong. So that's why I wanted to check with them. Turns out that there is no dating from their team. Right, so move on to the next one. Another recent study. Study finds missing genetic information in the human genome, contributing to evolutionary advancements. So this is different. So again, this is in these highly conserved regions, yet again, places that shouldn't change. And we compared across hundreds of different species now. They're looking at loads of different mammal species, and they're finding that these changes, like the HARs, these deletions they're finding, are also unique to us, unexpected and unique. So what they've actually gone through, I think it's now they've got several hundred of these. They're usually very small changes where information has just basically disappeared from crucial areas of this non-coding DNA that should be controlling basic functions of life, and that they should normally be a big problem. As you can see here, they say the deletions are strange because they affect large segments. Some of us are missing large chunks of our genome, Dr. Gottman said. These deletions should have negative effects and, as a result, be eliminated from the population by natural selection. That would be the expectation in normal terms of evolution. What they found instead is, no, they're not being eliminated because they're doing positive things. That these supposed errors have helped contribute again to our brain. Very strange. So areas that should have been 100% stable, not only do they suddenly mutate, but they're massively beneficial mutations. These deletions have turned off switches that were limiting the brain. So move on to the next one. Well, because we were asking about, was the was the human brain upgraded? Well, I'd say yes, but it's not all upgrades from this. And this kind of flashes back to something that came out in the original material, that if these were, as it says, survivors of a larger ship, blew up, came down, very limited, small crafts, the genetic engineering technologies they normally used, most of these were on the main craft. In the words of what was shared in this transfer, is that basically they had to do this with the medical kits on the saucer crafts they came down in. So there was errors. And there's a book that came out called Human Errors, which I recommend, because amongst what has been found, there's some really strange errors in human beings that, again, are not seen in the other primates, particularly to do with reproduction functions. That we compared like the infertility issues that humans have, and also childbirth, and the difficulty of childbirth, that in some ways it's a wonder we even have children. There's so many problems there. And again, evolution should sweep those away, because the crucial function of every organism is reproduction. Now that is an area where evolution should always tidy things up, but it can't in humans. Why can't it? Because those same sites that are engineered to do the brain are affecting the reproductive areas. They're also affecting areas that give us various genetic problems, serious conditions. That, again, should have been swept away by evolution in the normal run of events. We don't see them in the other species. We unfortunately have them locked in, because any time that evolution, the effect of evolution would have swept these away, it can't, because the brain is a massive benefit. And so as many of these other things, like opposable thumbs, all sorts of stuff that we have, the massive benefits, are also tied to these modifications, which were done not superbly, much as they seem to have been masters of genetics, with the limited technology they had retrieved from these ships. In their own words, they said a lot of the first generation failed, that they had horrific mutations. They had creatures that were born that just survived a few hours. So this wasn't all, all perfect. It played out the way you'd think, with remnants of their technology experimenting on us. And so we see that today. But we've also moved into a new era. We are now looking at modifying, in fact, we're doing, modifying the genome. You see, genetically modified humans, the X-Men of scientific research. So we're already looking at these areas and trying to fix them. But not just that. We're looking to use these technologies for our new emergence into space. Thus the cycle completes. For these beings that arrived here, using their genetic engineering technologies to colonize worlds, and again to upgrade us, now we're using them to upgrade ourselves and colonize new worlds. And here we've actually got one of the first experiments that's recently been done, is taking material from a tardigrade and mixing it with human cells to potentially make humans radiation proof for space. So we'll move on to the So our work is, my work and my team's work will be to continue delving into this. We've also got one paper already that I put out preprint. We're going to expand on that, talking more about the peptides. We're also going to be doing more with the genetics. We're looking to put out a paper on chromosome 2, and we will look to put out papers relating to the human accelerated regions and deletions. And we also, we'd like to track down the Algeringa if we can, but these are our main points at the moment, is to get some new papers out on this. There's also some other studies that we want to do related to peptide glass, so I won't go too into depth here, but I'll just say, look up an object linked to the Tunguska event, because there's an object that looks very much like the same kind of material. It comes down as the anomalous Tunguska event. We will be trying to engage with the media, engage with more scientists. We're looking to expand, bring on new scientific collaborators, Obviously we've got some funding, but of course we'll be looking to get more funding, and so we can expand to pay researchers to collaborate with us on papers. That is the agreement we have with our backer, is that we will look to produce scientific papers, put them out for peer review, and basically take on the establishment on its own turf. But we also understand, you know, it's going to be tough because, as we touched on earlier, this isn't all just about evidence. It's about paradigms. And this work, this does not fit with the current paradigm. There's very few scientists would even listen to this. They're like, well, what a load of rubbish, because it's never aliens. That's the paradigm. It's never aliens. You know, why talk to any of these people that see things on series, or that think that there's, you know, organisms raining from the sky? These loons, right? And there's no money in that. There's no funding to do that research because it's not in the paradigm. So we've got a lot to take on. But I think that, you know, we're seeing a sea change now, where the Overton window has moved enough. The news is talking about alien spaceships being recovered. You know, all of this is happening. The paradigm is moving enough that we might just be able to get this conversation out there. And once the public understand that there's real evidence for this, I think it will go bananas. So hopefully that is of interest to you all. Thank you. Yeah, we're going to appreciate it, and you know, thank you for seeing through all. I know there's quite a lot to the backstory, so thanks for bearing with me. So yeah, if you've got any questions, I'm very happy to try to answer them.
You mentioned 800,000 years ago where the brain was jumped in, in a very short period of time. Mainstream scientists probably say the term missing link. Could you say there's any parity between the term missing link and what you've just described 800,000 years ago?
Yeah, I'd say that now they accept there's kind of a couple of different missing links. So there's a missing link there, the ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. What was it? Nobody yet knows. Was it a Homo erectus? Was it something else? But there's a missing link between primates and us. So there's additional missing links when you go further back. So both of those are considered missing links in the record. Also add as well that the fossil record is quite fragmented, literally as well. But so you could argue for more missing links than that. But those are the two big ones, yeah. Something else? Sure.
So the researcher from Stanford looked at the genome and she saw that there was additional letters.
Mm-hmm.
What was her criteria for doing that? What was the range that she was looking at? And has she done anything in comparison to now, current genome?
Yeah, so the study that we mentioned where the sudden changes that they've detected. So that's ongoing. When they first began the HAR's project, I think it was about 15 years ago, and so that news that came out a few weeks ago is the same team that basically, the same scientist really, that first discovered these human accelerated regions. She's continued on with that, and so they've just got to the point where now they understand kind of what happened, but they don't really understand why it happened. They're looking to do, what I understand is they're going to look to, because I don't know if it's familiar, but a few weeks ago there was a big release of studies, and it was called the Zoonomia project. The Zoonomia project was comparing loads of different mammals' genomes, right? So when they did that, they could see all these weird differences that were just in humans. So that, again, that data is now being mined by a lot of different teams. And so some of the human deletion studies, they're also using that same data. But I think that's going to continue to produce new information because it's because it's parallel studies. They can use basically AI and big data now to kind of really see what's going on. So there's been a breakthrough in the technology. So I think we're going to start to see more from that team, but also other teams that now got all that same data. So that's why we're getting this human deletions has come out at the same time as the human accelerated regions paper, and there's going to be, I think, more and more of these. But they're definitely, they're still on there. I don't know, like they said to me they were trying to get the dating more accurate. I don't know to what degree, they don't seem to have any sort of speculative hypothesis, for why that happened. At the moment, that's not where they're at. Yeah, they haven't got to a thing of why it happened. In fact, the last time when she did come out with a hypothesis, a few years ago, because I had an article that was going to go in futurism, they were really interested in it. They went to her and said, what I was looking at, and so of course she straight away said, well, it's definitely not aliens. Right? Because of course it's never aliens, and so they dropped the story. But what she suggested to them could have happened had provided the journalist with papers showing that she's wrong, basically that her colleagues say, no, this didn't happen, that didn't happen. What she suggested, there's no explanation. So the consensus moment is there is no explanation for these changes, right? All they know is that they're very unexpected, profound, and have made us who we are, but that's it. So it's like a state category. At the moment, nobody understands why those have happened.
And it's only in human genome?
And only in the human genome, yeah. So unique to us. Hundreds of changes, unique to us. There are a few examples of acceleration in some other mammals, but nowhere near the numbers, and nothing to do, profound brain changes or anything like that. So it's very unique to us. These hundreds of changes with profound implications are unique to us. Out of all the mammals they've checked so far, I think it's 300 different mammal genomes that they've compared. So, I mean, it's pretty massive.
Do they do any forecasting at all?
Sorry?
Do they do any forecasting?
In terms,
With the evidence that they've got now,
right,
can they do, they've got like a forecasting model
of what will happen going
of
forward
what
with
will
it.
happen?
Well, one of the things that's being suggested is that these areas where we're seeing these massive changes, that they're continuing to throw out faster than normal evolutionary changes. And they think that some of the things that we see as like spectrum conditions or neurodiversity, autism and stuff like that, these are linked to the same areas in the genome. So when we get these people, some of these people you'll think got mad skills, like the people who can fly over London, draw the whole of London, right? Or they're these savants, right? They can calculate how many atoms in the universe. Well, these people, again, skills that are related to the same change, these same regions. So it seems to be throwing out these unique types of people. So that is ongoing. So that's been, again, if you want to look at that, so the HARs and neurodiversity, there seems to be a link. In a conversation I had with Dr. Gary Nolan a while back, he kind of agrees with me that we think that there's a kind of a new human evolving to do with this neurodiversity, and that we're seeing it, it's throwing out people with exceptional abilities. And so that, I think, is to do with, well, it could be the purpose of the manipulation, but also I think some of it's a response to what's happening in the world, that we're heading into multiple kind of crises. These new humans that are being produced, a lot of them are problem solvers with exceptional skills, engineers, scientists, and all sorts of people, and that they have the abilities to kind of reroute where humanity is going. So it does seem to be all tied up in these same changes that they found.
Genetic engineering.
Well, the genetic engineering, this is, well, you can see, yeah, so this would be ancient genetic engineering. Now, of course, we've got new genetic engineering, where people are going in and making these changes, but yeah.
What about the external factors? Because going back then, it's completely different to now.
Well, in terms of the
Well, you've got chemicals in the air, you've got chemicals in your food, you've got chemicals in your products that you use, female products. Sure,
yeah, we're being changed by those as well. Of course, yeah, there's things being done. I mean, for example, I don't know if you're familiar, but the current understanding is by about 2045, men globally will be functionally sterile, like on average. The average will be sterile. So that is tied up very closely with the chemicals that are in our plastics, our food.
So that's deliberate then?
Well, I would suggest so. Not necessarily from the same sources or beings, but obviously from humans. But yeah, it's hard not to see that as deliberate, because it's known, and it's like a species-ending event, and we're just colliding into it, whilst the mainstream are worrying about, there's lots of things to worry about, I understand, but with the worries about, say, climate change or anything else, what could be more profound than that we're all functionally sterile in like 20 odd years? I mean, and yet that's not the central topic. So you have to think someone is choosing to not have that discussed, that shouldn't be the prime time news. They're quite happy with the idea that we're going to be thinned out because we won't be able to reproduce.
So what about putting the fear out there, creating Stockholm syndrome?
Well, I mean,
so people make choices, think they're making choices, but they're not really.
Sure, I mean, we live in a climate of ongoing fear to make people have poor choices. I mean, that's an old problem.
So I think that, I personally believe that is linked to what you're talking about
right.
now with sterilisation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it can't. In terms of where we're going as a species, yeah, because only some people can be able to reproduce. I mean, is there any pattern to who those people are? And obviously, if it's the people controlling it, I imagine they're not taking these chemicals into them. So you can certainly say there's a eugenics aspect to this, for sure. I mean,
because it's a selective process, as you
right. I would say that these, the initial changes, obviously we're dealing with beings that are well ahead of us. There is a kind of eugenics type thing as well. I mean, again, it's people or beings that think they know best for where humanity should go. So this is like an old story that we're now in, the new story.
It's like when you quoted Benin, was it Benin who was explaining that it was a case of subjective institutionalized research, and that's what's being quoted, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, we don't get fully objective science, really. I mean, not on the whole. Again, this is that paradigm shift problem that, we're in a paradigm where certain science can be done, certain science can't be done, certain science is focused on, other science is suppressed. So we have a kind of shaping of the direction where humanity is wanted to go by people that have that influence and power. I mean, it's a very small, I'd say yes, a small number of people. It's about 2,000 people that are in the billionaire and 100 millionaire club. About 2,000 people. So when people about the 1%, that's wildly wrong. It's 0.001% of humanity that has that kind of power. A very small number of people.
Do you think there was something behind that, a lot deeper?
Well, I mean, certainly. I don't know if I can link it in with with this exactly, but yeah, I mean, of course, anyone who's in the fringe world, all these topics, and I keep, most of the topics that we consider fringe. That, I mean, I would suggest that that we've been manipulated by groups going back, millennia. That that as long as pretty much from the rise of farming and the control of land, the suppression of one group with power above them. So yeah, I mean, there's I can't remember now. There's a good researcher, and she says, look, these people that are doing this today, who are in control of our sciences, and stuff, they see themselves as farmers. And what they want now is to be the one eye in the sky with their floating satellite systems and their surveillance. So that's the direction they'd like it to go, to basically farming us as livestock, culling us, controlling us, changing us, all of that. I mean, if we wise up, there's no reason that should happen, but that's what they would like. That's what they'd like. So, anyone else? Thank you. Does anyone else want to ask? Sure.
You're slightly off piece now. Two things. One, have you ever had any UFO sighting yourself? Number one. And number two, you talked earlier about Mars. What do you think is likely to be found there? Do you think there was a human presence there?
Right. Yeah, I've had a few different UFO experiences. The one that was the most impressive, I think it was probably, I was about 20, so I'm 45 now, 46. And that was out in Malmesbury, in Gloucestershire. It's like a little village kind of area. We were out in the countryside. There was 5 of us in a car driving back quite late at night. And we noticed an object that was basically, it was jumping around the sky. So it'd be in one place, a point of light, and then it'd be over there, and then it'd be going up, and then it'd be going down. So we got out of the car, and we were all just watching it. Thought, well, I don't know of anything that can go that fast, do you know what I mean? And if they were all coming down, you'd say, okay, meteorites, right? But not when they're going up, and then it's going left, So it clearly was not normal, and there was no way I can match that to technologies I understand, like with RAF planes. I mean, so it was clearly sort of something that could move so quick that it looked like teleporting to us. Now, I don't know if it was teleporting, if it was, this kind of story of them bending space and then they snap back. That's what it looked like it's bending space and then it's somewhere else. I've also seen the orange orbs, which I know a lot of people have seen as well. That was back to about, I think, 2001, something like that. I was living in Essex. I reported that. That was in UFO magazine, which was now long defunct, but they covered that. It was probably about a dozen of them, went from one horizon to the other in probably about 20 seconds. It was so fast. I thought, well, I know Chinese balloons don't travel at that speed, do you know what I mean? So people would always say stuff, is it those? But these were really moving, I'd say that. So, and they're in a kind of loose formation, so I thought it was worth reporting. So those are probably the two, the main ones I've seen, and then, sorry, what was the other question?
It's all about Mars.
About Mars, yeah. What do I think's on Mars? I do tend to that view, the idea of the evidence of a Martian war, that there's this signature of nuclear explosions on Mars. It seems like a pretty convincing argument. Some of these images definitely seem to show what could be, structures that were ruined in a cataclysm, you know what I mean? So when you see these kind of regular looking lines and structures, I know they call it, within an area they call Atlantis Chaos, which is funny they've chosen that name, but it seems to be, almost looks a bit like a city that's in that site. So somebody in NASA may be having a joke with us calling it Atlantis, but yeah, I do think that we may also find that there's, well, I'm pretty sure there's life, what we can see like with the mushrooms and that, but there's going to be at the minimum they're going to find plants, not just bacteria. I think there's plants, there's fungi. Is there something under the surface? Well, if there was a war, it makes some sense that there would have been underground, bunkers, areas people would have been going to. I think there's a good chance, particularly now that a lot of other countries are going into space, do you know what I mean? Which is, it used to be all under NASA's control. but I'm left wondering what will happen if China or someone stumbles on one of these sites and is the first to announce it. Is NASA and the US ready for that to happen, lose control of that story, and have maybe China come out and say, well, we found a city on Mars? So I think, you know, we might be living in a period where their hand is being forced as more and more nations go into space. And that I do suspect that, yeah, we're going to find life and traces of intelligence, you know. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, similar question, but instead of Mars, Moon. What's your take on the ancient artifact?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of really good images. I think, some of you know the name, the guy that does a lot of the analysis of images from the moon, but there's, I've forgotten now, but there's a couple. There's one that shows what looks like an entrance into a tunnel system. Looks very much like an entrance into a tunnel system. So again, you know, we know that much of the moon is hollow, and I think that the trend is going to be with advanced civilizations is they go underground. I think for a few reasons. One, if you know that there's a lot of other beings out there, hiding yourself from them makes a lot of sense. That, you know, you keep your bases and stuff underground, and that we're the kind of the Muppets that are visible. That, you know, anyone else is here, was on other planets. I think it's all going to be about underground, and that, you know, if we do start to go into some of these what look like entrances, that I think there's a good chance there's either active or defunct technology there. I mean, there's other sites with what look like, you know, domes and really strange, you know, it's like kind of satellite detectors, you know, sort of strange stuff up there. So, I mean, I think if we've had advanced civilizations that have gone through in the past, probably still here, but at the very least have been here in the past, we should see their remnants on many worlds and on asteroids. And do you know what I mean? I think it's going to be found throughout the solar system that we're going to find debris, you know, technologies, underground areas. That's my current view. I think it's going to be throughout the whole solar system. Yeah. Sorry, is it down there? Sure.
You know where the aliens are altering our DNA billions of years ago? Why did they design it to be 70 years plus? Why couldn't they make us live for 1,000 years so we can take that knowledge, you know, instead of, you know, dying off when we've gained all that knowledge kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think they certainly could have, because we're starting to understand now that there are areas you can modify that should extend life, because we're seeing it in other animals. You know, we're seeing these genes that are switched off in humans, so that potentially we could live a lot longer. So yeah, you have to wonder. I mean, one of the things that was said in this particular case is that one of the reasons why they actually engineered us in the first place was that, again, it gets a bit esoteric, is the idea that souls reincarnate, but also that they wanted this form, the human form, to act as a vehicle for the souls of other beings that are quite negative. They said that basically it was like a rehab for these beings. The Earth would be a kind of a rehab for these beings to incarnate into. They said there'd be positive beings here too, but some of the negative beings that live in this part of the cosmos would be incarnating into the human form, and you're going through a learning stage. So possibly when you look at some of the people, what would the world be like, say, if some of the worst people lived for 2,000 years and they didn't die off? I mean, some of these people would have unbelievable Orwellian control of us. So I mean, maybe they did see that if you're going to have negative souls incarnating, do you want them to live for long periods of time? Probably not, because it's supposed to be learning lessons, improving is the hope. That's the way they explained it. Now I know that reincarnation again adds another layer of weirdness to this, which again, for the average scientist, is straight away is, you know, get out of here with that, right? But we do know that in, obviously, the studies that I guess a lot of you might be familiar with, that Ian Stevenson's work on reincarnation was so, Professor Ian Stevenson of Virginia University, his work was so impressive that even Carl Sagan said, you know, of all the paranormal sounding things that sense, this is one of the only ones we should take seriously, because his work was so strong to show there was reincarnation, that some form of continuance. Of course, it's never really broken through mainstream because it just doesn't fit with the paradigm. So, and we know that in Tibet, the High Lamas, they say, look, we direct our next birth. We choose where we're going to be born, because, you know, we developed our consciousness to such a level. So what are some of the consciousness of some of these other beings like? When we hear these stories of, you know, star seeds and people have memories of lives on other worlds, if you get to a point where you can direct your mind across the cosmos to incarnate into a human being, that's ahead of that Gelugpa Lama in Tibet. You know, so if we can do it, I don't see why these other beings can't. So although the story is very strange,
right? But if that is accurate, I think it would go some way to explain why they don't want us to have these long lives. I think this is supposed to be a kind of a learning curve where you go through many, many, many incarnations, rather than probably like them, who may well be living for vast periods of time. If they've got these technologies perfected, who knows, maybe they're immortal, you know, they could be.
You know that knowledge you've built up through your life, is that when you reincarnate into some other body, isn't that white and then you've got to start all over again?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be entirely, no, because you don't remember the specifics of your life, but at least then it seems like there's a part of you, like your core, what you've become, continues. So like, for example, if you died in your last life as an unbelievably compassionate and a wise, intelligent person, although you won't remember how you got to that, you still will be like that in that next life. But you might take another detour in that life, do something terrible, and start heading back the other way. That's not necessarily a given. But it seems that there's a continuance of your core personality and how you are as a being. So again, like if you had been very inclined towards study and accumulation of knowledge in your last life, you then probably very likely do the same again. So you might have scientists have been scientists, since science began. They're people that have been drawn to that. And so they keep going back to it and going back to it. And when you do the regressions, a lot of times people say, basically, you're almost doing the same job you had in ancient Egypt now. That you were a scribe then, and now you're a writer, and stuff like that. Like really weird stuff. So it seems like that aspect of someone can flow through, as well as, other traits, characteristics. I mean, they found that obviously some people, even like how they looked, or injuries they'd had in past lives, would have birthmarks, so there's things that are continuing. And of course, some people have spontaneous past life memories. So it doesn't seem like the wiping process is absolute. Do you know what I mean? You can access it, and in some cases, we don't know why some people more than others, but there seems to be spontaneous recall where people realising that, I used to live here and I remember the people, So it's a very strange, it's still a mysterious process, but I do think there's an accumulation of evidence to say, yeah, we are continuing in some way, even though we lose the details of, what our name was maybe and who we used to hang out with and all that, but yeah. Thanks. Sure.
I was just wondering, humans are by nature telepathic. And we have been all of our history. And we lose it now because we're in a modern society and we don't need to use that skill. We've lost it probably for thousands of years. But there's still some of us who retain it.
Sure.
There's still some of us who can talk to our loved ones, and receive messages and like that. And we've heard stories of tribal people in Africa and Aboriginal Australia who literally communicate over vast distances without even batting an eyelid. They just feel it's natural. They just listen to their loved ones and their family members and their tribal members, talk to each other that way. And I'm wondering, were we chosen because we can do that, as opposed to Homo habilis and all the other types of sort of ape men at the time couldn't do that. So the Homo sapiens had that ability. Were we chosen for that ability?
Maybe because we were compatible, because the real kids all had it on the eyes, and perhaps we're naturally compatible.
Yes. Were we chosen because we had that mental acuity already, rather than did we acquire it because of the genetic engineering?
Well, I think the time I'm talking about is pre-Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
So we are emerging as Homo sapiens from these events.
So we were a separate group to the others. By that point.
Only at that point. Because we were created at that point.
We weren't Neanderthal, we weren't Homo habilis, we weren't Homo erectus. We were still a separate Homo group.
Right. Yeah.
Were we chosen because we had that sentience,
that
ability to be telepathic, or were we granted that by the changes?
Well, my understanding, because I can't give you an absolute answer, but one of the things I do know is that in these same regions where we're seeing changes, one of the genes that is notable is to do with speech, right? And also there's some areas there that also impact like the basal ganglia. If you know, like Gary Nolan's work on that he's finding a link with abnormal sized basal ganglias and neuroganglias in the brain, and intuition. And so some of these same areas where we're seeing these anomalous changes, they seem to be linked with both our ability to have language and with our intuition. So I think that was engineered in. That at the same time they're giving us the ability to potentially speak, they're also increasing our intuitive capabilities. Now, I don't know, of course, whether we already had them as ancient hominins before the Homo sapiens lineage, or whether they only begin with that, because we need to know really more about the genome of our missing link ancestor, because we're not sure who even that ancestor was. That's the problem, is that we can't even be sure if it was Homo erectus. So we can't say who was that ancestor, what skills did they have, until we narrow down, get DNA from a being that lived, 800,000 years ago or before. At the moment, the oldest DNA we have from a human ancestor is 550,000 years old. So for me, I'd love to see is the discovery of recoverable DNA from a Homo erectus, from 800,000 years, a million years back, so we can start to understand, first of all, is it our ancestor? And the other thing it would show is it radically different from us? Because if you've got that comparison, and you can say, something doesn't add up here, these are supposed to be our ancestors, and yet we've got massive DNA changes, something's happened here that's not normal evolution. So we really need to get that genome, and then we'll be able to have a better answer to that. But certainly, I think it's telling that the fact that where, Nolan and people are seeing these strange anomalies in intuitive people, that they tie back to areas of the genome associated with what I'm looking at, these manipulations. So I suspect that they were engineering in intuitive capabilities on top of speech. Now, I don't know what you're saying. I don't know whether we already had those. I can't say. My suspicion is maybe we did, but they've improved them.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. One more question? Oh, there's two there. Okay, go on then. Two. Is that right?
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
Right,
yeah.
So you mentioned about the abrupt change to do with the language, because I remember seeing Greg Braden at a conference last year, and he was talking about the change that within the throat are, and it was like literally on Tuesday afternoon we didn't have it, and then Wednesday morning, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, like you're kind of alluding to tonight, that suddenly we have the power of speech, which of course is a game changer.
Yeah.
Because then you've got language and symbols and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So, and like you're saying, so he was saying that, well, who did it? Because it's all very well, it's there's evolution, like you were saying, that just things happen over a period of time, and but this was like a deliberate, like this was like genetic engineering or hybridization, or whatever you want to call it. And then you mentioned about the new word for junk DNA. What can you remember what that was?
Non-coding.
Ah, okay. Yeah. So that again is quite a recent change, because I know that the way that I was heard back again in one of the conferences from years ago is that the scientists were using that because they didn't actually really know, and they didn't want to be feeling stupid, so they kind of got like just junk because they hadn't figured out, or some of them, like, they didn't want the rest of us, if you like, to know the capabilities of potential upgrade in our DNA, which would give us more power, like telepathy and teleportation and bilocation and all the things that we potentially, I think, have got. Do you think going forward with your sort of studies, and that we're clearly fast-tracking through time and space now because of the age of Aquarius, and we know that something major is coming, the fact that the UFOs are now being taught in mainstream, they're kind of setting it up for something, and so suddenly you're probably, good for you, your research will become more interesting, because clearly they're heading the way that they've been drip feeding us for years. So do you think, given this massive upgrade by something or some other beings, that is likely to happen now with this, now that our DNA, because they're talking about DNA being switched on, and that we're going to get more strands coming activated, for want of a better word. Do you imagine that will be happening now?
I think, definitely, well, on the first point there, I definitely think that a big part of why they call it junk DNA, was a kind of arrogance, that they didn't really know what it was. So, if we don't know as the experts, it must be just a load of crap, it's not doing anything. And which was just super arrogant, because you're asked, why was it all there? Why hadn't evolution swept it away if it was just a load of rubbish? So obviously now they understand that actually, no, that was totally wrong. There's very little there that is doing nothing. There is some, but most of it has a function. And now we're starting to understand that these functions, not only have they got functions, they're super, super important. That, there's not that many genes, but there's loads and loads of code for controlling those genes. So that's what's in that non-coding DNA. And like, if you know, basically, if you know how to work with that, forget about the genes, because we're doing genetic engineering. If you know how to do the genome engineering and you understand what's in that non-coding, like you could turn a person into, whatever you want, a lion or something. You can literally go and say, like, I want longer legs, turn off this, express this longer, bigger head. So from the same egg that would be, a human egg, you could have a monster or whatever you want come out of that. If you really understand that area of the genome. Not quite to that. They can't understand these areas enough. Because if they change one of these highly conserved areas, they're almost certainly going to kill the organism. Because the beings that have done this are next level. They're playing us like the piano. They know the DNA code like that. Like, whereas we're just getting to that thing where, we can put in a bit of this organism, we can do this, we can make you stronger, super soldier type stuff is what they're looking at, and obviously astronauts with superpowers. They can do some of that, but not to go, okay, we're just going to turn a human into, an aardvark or something, which is, this is, I don't know if it's 1,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years ahead of us. We will be able to do it if we carry on. But I think if they do it now, they're just going to be killing loads of people, basically just trying to, we'll just try this on you, try that. Because these regions, they don't really understand what half of them do. So, one change, like I said, it took 300 million years for 2 successful changes by natural means in one of these regions. So, what's the chances we just start guessing at these, we're going to be successful? They're going to just kill a lot of fetuses, really, doing that. But they are getting to a point where obviously they can change aspects of who we are. But I don't think that they're anywhere near this level. No way.
No, but it's again, it goes back to like who did it. That, I think
right, and it's so far advanced that
going back into the ancient aliens, like there were other.
Yeah, and these intelligences understand
changes, and like, never mind that they happen.
My feeling, just to clarify there as well, my feeling is they know this code so well because DNA is artificial. DNA is a terraforming technology. Spray it down on a planet, barren planet, biosphere. So if you're amongst those worlds that help design the code, that know the code off the back of your hand, then you can do all these changes. But for us, I don't think we're there. Not unless we interact with those beings or some of these other beings, and they say, make a little change here. But without their help, I don't think we could do it.
But you just contradicted yourself, really, because you said about the eugenics programs and you said about geoengineering.
They can do, but not to this level. That's what I'm saying, not to the level of changing a person into an aardvark.
Experiment, as you pointed out as well.
They can do experiments. I don't think they're anywhere near the level of these beings. That's what I'm saying. But I'm nowhere near.
You disagree on that. I've seen information and research myself, the chimeras.
Yeah. Okay.
The last question.
Yeah.
You spoke about sterilisation. Who's behind that and why?
I mean, again, I can't say because I'm not in those circles, but I'd theorise that when you look at the fact there's 2,000 people with billions or hundreds of millions, it's a pretty safe bet it's going to be amongst those 2,000 people. And that's such a small number of people. And there was a guy that came out a few years back, he said he'd been working as a financier and a banker in those circles, moving their money around, funding things like the collapse of the Italian economy. He did all sorts of stuff that he's involved in. He said that it is around that, a couple of thousand people. He said that they love, he said there's nothing more we love than destroying nature. He said that we'd love to see people's, businesses ruined. He said, you don't understand. He said, you do not understand the pleasure that we get from it, because you people couldn't understand it. He said, we're all damaged people. He said, everyone involved has either been through some sort of abuse, deliberate abuse, or had abuse and pain in their lives, and these are broken people. He said, all of us that are involved in this are broken people, and that we are capable of doing things that other people would not understand. There's no emotional connection to what we do to you or to nature. We love the idea of destroying the natural world. So that's the ultimate. So if it's these kind of minds, total psychopaths, people that, he feels though they should be in some way rehabilitated and shown compassion, brought back in and healed. I don't know whether that's possible. Obviously, it'd be nice if it was. I don't think we really want big long hangings of thousands of people, but I don't know what the solution is. If they're that broken and that dangerous with that much power, then call them what we want, New World Order, but it seems that there certainly is a cabal of people with this amount of power that have an absolute contempt for us, for nature, for all of it. I think that we're the majority. It just takes most people realising that these people aren't above you. There's no power in government, there's no power in these bankers, no power in people. It's the power we hallucinate onto them. As long as we keep believing that they're above us and they have power over us, it will keep churning along. As soon as we all realise, hang on, these are just people like us.
Batteries.
We've got to realise that we don't have to be supporting any of what they do. But that's my take. But I can't say who those people are, because obviously there's a lot of different opinions in it,
Yeah, but you've got species as well. You haven't touched on species. Different species. Oh. This is species, isn't it? It's not just people. they're not human if they're doing
I mean,
that,
I
let's be honest.
there's a lot of different takes on it. Again, I would be, because I'm not an insider, I have no clearances, and I've never worked with Illuminati or anything like that. All I can do is repeat back to you stories that you probably heard and other people here have heard, because I have no access to those people. I can only sort of speculate like Reverend everyone else.
It might come across a bit conspiratorial, but
sure.
Bill Gates was very involved in the COVID vaccine, and if you look into his family, they were eugenicists.
Yeah. I mean, look at the Sanger Institute and stuff, they're all eugenicists. They're all accepted as just mainstream science now. They just changed the names of their organisations and carried on. So
he wasn't elected by anybody, he was in charge of all of it, you know what I mean?
Again, I would suggest that people like that, the people you visibly see, are just frontmen, salespeople for people you don't see, and that the people that are doing most of this will be hidden behind trillion-dollar holding companies like BlackRock, State Street, that these people sit quietly in a boardroom and they tell, we'll get Bill Gates to go out and do that, or, you know, get this one to... I doubt we know the names of most of the people that do this stuff. You know what I mean? That they put their front people out there who are yes men. They're given money to do things, to act in certain ways. But, you know, if you were really behind it, you're going to hide, right? You don't want your name out there on the agenda. You want, you know, Bill Gates as your fall guy for whatever you've got on him. I mean, look at the Epstein stuff. If you've got enough stuff on enough people, you know, they do what they're told, because they don't want the next news story to be that they're a pedo that's been caught out, you know, and here's the footage. None of those people want it. All they need to have enough people to be able to keep those people doing what they want them to do. That's my feeling on how you manipulate an agenda on this scale, including hiding things like aliens and all the rest of it. If you've got people that you've got so much stuff on, you know, presidents, heads of infrastructure, you know, these people, if they, at the end of the day, come to you and have to say, yes, sir, what do I do for you now? You know, then that's realistically, that's how you're going to do it. You're not going to put yourself up there as, you know, I'm Mr. Big, I'm running it. You're going to get these people out there that make them do it. I've got stuff on them. You know, they've got whatever they've got from... So, I mean, you can understand what I mean. So, I think although he's doing stuff for their agenda, which is very obvious, you know, but at the same time, I don't think that it's coming directly from him. But yes, he's connected back into the banking families, back into the eugenics movement. So, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't have to do that.